At first light on June 6, 1944, the German defense of France faced a contradiction that should have been impossible. Allied troops were fighting for a foothold on the Normandy coast. German armored formations existed that could reinforce the threatened sector. Crews could fuel vehicles, start engines, and prepare to move. But the officers closest to the invasion did not control all the armor they believed they needed. The problem was not simply distance, it was authority. How did a defense built around the idea of an armored counterattack create a command system that could not counterattack quickly when the invasion actually came? The answer begins before D-Day, inside a strategic argument that had no clean solution. By the spring of 1944, German commanders in the West knew that an Allied cross-channel invasion was coming. They did not know exactly where it would land, and that uncertainty shaped everything. The Atlantic Wall could slow an assault. Coastal guns, mines, bunkers, obstacles, and infantry could make the beaches expensive. But even German planners understood that fixed defenses alone could not guarantee that an invasion would be destroyed. If Allied troops established a bridgehead and began unloading tanks, artillery, ammunition, fuel, engineers, and fresh infantry, the balance would change hour by hour. A landing force that looked fragile in the surf could become a functioning army before the day was over. That made the Panzer divisions crucial. The argument was over where they should be placed, who should control them, and when they should be committed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, feared one thing above almost everything else: Allied air power. His experience had convinced him that a large German armored formation moving in daylight could not count on freedom of movement. Roads could be watched, junctions could be attacked. Fuel trucks, maintenance vehicles, half-tracks, artillery tractors, and other soft-skinned support vehicles were easier to damage than tanks. Yet without them a Panzer division could not fight as a division. Rommel therefore wanted armored forces positioned close enough to the coast to attack before Allied air superiority and naval firepower could fully shape the battlefield. His logic was brutal and simple. The invasion had to be broken while the landing force was still disorganized. The longer Germany waited, the harder the task became. But the opposing argument was also serious. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, had to think about more than one stretch of beach. German forces were defending an enormous coastline, and Allied deception made the problem worse. The Germans expected a major invasion. They also expected deception around that invasion. The Pas de Calais remained an obvious danger, because it offered the shortest route across the English Channel. Allied deception efforts reinforced German fears that a landing somewhere else might be a diversion intended to pull reserves away from the true blow. From that perspective, placing too much armor close to one coastline carried its own risk. If the first reported landing was not the decisive invasion, Germany could commit its mobile reserve to the wrong battle and lose the ability to respond elsewhere. A centralized armored reserve therefore had a logic of its own. Keep the strongest formations inland, wait until the main Allied effort is identified, then concentrate them and strike as a mass. This was the classic promise of mobile reserve warfare. Do not scatter your strength before you know where the decisive fight will be. The problem was that Rommel's solution and Rundstedt's solution demanded opposite things from the same tanks. Rommel wanted them close enough to move immediately. The reserve concept wanted them far enough back to remain flexible. Rommel wanted local commanders to respond before the enemy consolidated. The reserve concept depended on waiting until the strategic picture was clearer. Both ideas were trying to solve real dangers. They could not both be fully implemented at the same time. The final arrangement did not resolve the contradiction. It institutionalized it. German armored forces in France were divided among different command relationships. Some formations were available under local or theater command. Others were held as higher-level reserves, whose movement required approval from the top. That division mattered more than any line drawn on a headquarters map. It meant that physical proximity and legal authority were no longer the same thing. A commander could see the battlefield changing and still lack the power to release the formation that might influence it. An armored division could be operationally ready and still be politically locked. That was the system waiting for the invasion. The arrangement also created a misleading picture of strength. On a map, several armored divisions in France could be marked as available forces. But a map symbol does not show who is allowed to move the unit, how long a request must travel, or whether the formation is positioned for the kind of mission commanders expect it to perform. The source identifies the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr among the major formations whose release became part of the higher-level reserve problem. These were not interchangeable battalions that could simply be detached and sent down one road. They were large combined arms organizations. Their tanks mattered, but so did their infantry, artillery, engineers, maintenance, fuel, ammunition, communications, and route planning. To use them effectively, a commander needed more than permission to start engines. He needed enough notice to assemble columns, select routes, coordinate movement, avoid traffic conflicts, and decide where the division should enter the fight. That makes the command problem larger than the popular image of a telephone beside a sleeping headquarters. The delay began before any individual call failed. It began when the architecture of authority was designed. German commanders had tried to solve uncertainty by dividing control. One layer retained forces for immediate local defense, another preserved a strategic reserve. The political leadership retained final influence over the most important formations. On paper, this prevented one commander from gambling away Germany's armored strength on the first alarm. In practice, it meant that the response to a fast-moving invasion depended on several headquarters reaching the same conclusion quickly, even though they were receiving different information and carrying different responsibilities. The local commander was rewarded for reacting to what was physically happening. The higher command was rewarded for protecting against what might still happen. Those incentives pointed in opposite directions, and the Allied deception plan exploited exactly that gap. Shortly after midnight on June 6, reports began arriving from Normandy. Airborne troops were coming down behind the coast. Communications were disrupted. Local headquarters received incomplete and sometimes contradictory information. At that hour, the first problem was identification. Was this a major airborne operation supporting the main invasion? A diversion? A raid? The opening move of something larger? The men closest to the coast did not have the luxury of asking the question in the abstract. They were hearing reports from units already in contact. Higher headquarters had a different problem. They were trying to decide whether Normandy was the main event or one piece of a wider Allied deception plan. That gap between local urgency and strategic uncertainty became the central pressure of the morning. The source account describes early efforts by Rundstedt's command to move powerful reserve formations toward Normandy, followed by intervention from higher command because those formations were not his to release on his own authority. The exact administrative sequence and timing should not be treated casually, but the structural fact is the important one. The most senior German commander in the West did not possess unrestricted authority over every major armored reserve in his theater. That meant a request from the battlefield could travel upward through several levels before a release order traveled back down. Each level had reasons to hesitate. Local commanders saw ships, paratroopers, bombardment, and collapsing positions. Theater commanders saw a dangerous invasion but also knew the enemy might still land elsewhere. The high command saw the strategic reserve as a final card that should not be spent until the situation was unmistakable. The result was not one irrational decision. It was a chain of individually defensible delays that became collectively disastrous. The Germans had built a command system that demanded certainty from a battlefield designed to produce confusion, and the Allies were moving faster than that system could think. At the beaches, the first assault waves were in a genuinely dangerous position. Men were separated from units. Equipment was lost in the surf. Some exits were blocked by fire. Engineers were trying to clear obstacles and paths. Commanders did not always know what had landed, what had been destroyed, or what could move inland. The famous scale of the invasion can hide how vulnerable a beachhead is during its first hours. An amphibious landing does not arrive as a finished army. It has to build one. Every vehicle that reaches firm ground matters. Every artillery piece that is unloaded matters. Every road exit that opens matters. Every radio net that begins working matters. Every reserve company that finds its unit matters. That process takes time. And on June 6, time was exactly what the German command structure was giving the Allies. One German armored formation was much closer to the action than the higher reserves, the 21st Panzer Division around Cannes. Unlike formations held under direct higher-level control, the 21st Panzer existed inside the local defensive system and represented the most immediate armored threat to the British and Canadian sectors. On paper, this looked like the answer to Rommel's argument: armor close to the coast. A force that could respond without waiting for the entire strategic reserve to be unlocked. But having authority to use a formation does not mean the formation will be used with perfect speed or clarity. The battlefield behind the British beaches was already complicated by airborne landings east of the Orne, reports from the coast, disrupted communications, and uncertainty about where the most dangerous threat actually lay. The 21st Panzer did not emerge from that confusion as one clean, immediate hammer blow. Its elements were pulled by competing demands. Some forces were directed toward the airborne threat. Later, the pressure from the beach landings forced attention back toward the coast. Movement around Cannes cost time, traffic, changing orders, local fighting, and the need to assemble combat groups reduced the value of the division's proximity. By the time a substantial armored thrust pushed toward the British sector, the tactical situation had already changed. The landing force was no longer only men in the surf. British units had moved inland. Anti-tank weapons were appearing in useful positions. Offshore naval guns could engage German movement near the coast. The air overhead increasingly favored the Allies. The 21st Panzer did achieve something that reveals how dangerous an earlier, larger armored response might have been. Parts of the division penetrated toward the coast and briefly created a serious local threat. But the attack did not become the overwhelming counterstroke that German planners had imagined. It was too limited, too late, and too isolated to reverse the invasion. The 21st Panzer episode also reveals another weakness in the German system. Movement itself did not equal concentration. A division could receive orders and still lose combat power before it ever reached the objective. If different elements were sent toward different threats, if roads became congested, if staff information lagged behind events, or if subordinate units had to reverse direction, the formation could arrive as fragments rather than as a coordinated mass. That mattered because the source describes these formations as more than tanks alone. Their mechanized infantry, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, communications, and other support elements had to remain connected for the armored force to arrive with useful combat power. The German defense in Normandy would later become famous for fierce local counterattacks. But a local attack and a theater-level counterstroke were not the same thing. The strategic idea required multiple formations to arrive at the correct sector, with enough cohesion to create a decisive operational effect. On the morning of June 6, the German command never produced that concentration during the narrow window when the Allied landing zones were at their least mature. The failure, therefore, had several layers. First, the armored force was geographically divided. Second, authority over it was divided. Third, the intelligence picture was divided between what local commanders could see and what the high command feared might still be hidden. Fourth, once movement began, the road network air threat and battlefield congestion imposed a physical penalty for every earlier hour of indecision. A headquarters delay became a formation delay. A formation delay became a loss of concentration. A loss of concentration meant that even powerful units entered the battle under less favorable conditions than the doctrine had assumed. That local episode is important because it strips away a comforting explanation. Germany's problem on D-Day was not that every armored unit was hundreds of miles away. Armor existed near the battlefield. The deeper problem was that the entire defensive concept had never produced one fast, unified answer to the question that mattered most. Who could commit the decisive force at the decisive moment without waiting for permission from farther away? As the morning advanced, the Allied position changed visibly. The beaches became less like landing sites and more like logistics hubs. Landing craft continued to arrive. Vehicles came ashore. Engineers opened routes. Infantry pushed beyond the immediate beach exits. Artillery and anti-tank guns were brought forward. Command posts became more organized. Units that had landed in fragments began reconnecting. A bridgehead is not a line on a map. It is a growing system. Germany had needed to attack that system before it matured. Instead, the German command was still deciding how much of its own system it was willing to release. This is where Allied deception became more than an intelligence success. It became a time weapon. Operation Fortitude and the broader deception effort had encouraged German leaders to keep watching the Pas de Calais even after the Normandy landings began. That did not mean German headquarters believed nothing serious was happening in Normandy. They knew a major battle was underway. The more dangerous uncertainty was whether Normandy was the decisive battle. If it was only the first move, then committing the strategic armored reserve too early could expose the true invasion area later. That possibility imposed a mental tax on every decision. Reports from Normandy had to compete with a scenario that existed partly in German expectation and partly in Allied deception. The officers at the coast were reacting to what they could see. The officers farther away were reacting to what they feared they had not yet seen. The difference was enormous. For the local commander, delay meant losing ground now. For the high command, premature commitment might mean losing the ability to respond later. A decentralized system can be wrong quickly. A heavily centralized system can be wrong slowly. On D-Day, slowness carried its own strategic cost. By late morning and early afternoon, the problem facing the reserves was no longer the same problem that had existed before dawn. A move that might have been made in darkness now had to be made in daylight. That changed the physical environment of the march. Allied aircraft were not magic tank killers, and battlefield claims about destroyed armor could be exaggerated. But tactical air power did not need to annihilate every tank to damage an armored division's effectiveness. It could attack road traffic, force dispersal, hit soft-skinned vehicles, disrupt fuel and ammunition movement, damage bridges and junctions, and make commanders avoid exposed routes or pause movement. A Panzer division was more than its tanks. It was fuel trucks, recovery vehicles, maintenance crews, artillery, infantry carriers, staff vehicles, communication columns, engineers, and traffic control. Interrupt enough of that machinery and the division arrives late, fragmented, or exhausted even if many of its tanks survive. That is why Rommel had feared daylight movement so intensely. The danger was not only destruction. The danger was friction. Every forced halt widened the gap between the reserve and the battle it was supposed to influence. Every detour made coordination harder. Every damaged truck threatened the fuel or ammunition needed later. Every hour allowed the Allied bridgehead to receive more of exactly the equipment needed to resist a counterattack. The command delay and Allied air superiority therefore interacted. The first made the second more dangerous. A decision postponed in a headquarters became a movement problem on a road. A movement problem on a road became a combat problem at the front. And by the time that combat problem arrived, the enemy had changed. When the higher armored reserves were finally released for movement toward Normandy, they were not moving toward the battlefield German planners had imagined before dawn. They were moving toward a stronger one. The roads were exposed. The approaches were congested. Allied aircraft were active. The beachheads were deeper. Naval gunfire remained available near the coast. Allied anti-tank defenses were improving. The invasion force had gained the one resource that a counterattack was supposed to deny it: time. And time had a material form. It looked like beach exits being opened and secured. It looked like anti-tank guns and artillery coming ashore and taking positions. It looked like ammunition dumps expanding and fresh infantry moving inland. It looked like Sherman tanks coming through the surf to provide heavier support, while the first assault units pushed beyond the immediate beaches. It looked like field hospitals and command positions taking shape behind the fighting line. None of those changes guaranteed that the bridgehead was safe. German resistance remained dangerous, and several Allied sectors faced severe pressure. But each change raised the cost of the counterattack Germany still hoped to launch. This is one of the most important differences between a map and a battle. A map may show the same 5 beach names at dawn and in the afternoon. The symbols appear unchanged. The real battlefield underneath those symbols is completely different. At dawn, the question is whether the landing force can survive long enough to organize. Later, the question becomes whether the defender can mass enough combat power to break an organization that is already functioning. The German chain of command was trying to answer the first question after the battlefield had begun moving toward the second. This is why the story cannot be reduced to a sleeping dictator or one delayed telephone call. Personal decisions at the top mattered. Centralization around Hitler mattered. Fear of committing the reserve to the wrong battlefield mattered. But focusing on one sleeping man can hide the more serious failure. The system was designed so that one man's permission mattered this much in the first place. That distinction matters because the simplified version can actually make the German failure look accidental. If the story is only that Hitler slept while Normandy burned, then the solution appears obvious. Wake him earlier. But even an earlier decision would still have operated inside a force structure divided by competing doctrines, uncertain intelligence, road distance, local command friction, and the expectation of another landing farther north. The deeper question is why the Western Command required such a narrow approval channel for forces whose value depended on speed. The source describes the reserve system as a product of suspicion and centralized political control. Major armored formations could exist inside the Western theater, while the authority to release them remained concentrated above the commanders confronting the invasion directly. That created a strange battlefield reality. Local officers could respond with forces already under their control, yet still lacked the power to commit the heavier reserve they believed the situation required. On June 6, the bottleneck sat exactly at that boundary. Local officers could improvise with what they controlled. They could reposition available battalions, react to airborne threats, defend road junctions, and organize local counterattacks. What they could not do was freely transform the theater reserve into an immediate Normandy counterstroke. So the most important missing resource was not courage or willingness. It was delegated decision authority at the level where time and information met. The chain of command separated information from authority. The farther an officer stood from the coast, the more power he could possess over formations that the men at the coast desperately wanted. The closer an officer stood to the actual invasion, the clearer the emergency could look while his freedom to act remained limited. That was not merely bad luck on June 6. It was the result of a command philosophy that valued control at the top over initiative below it. Centralization can prevent reckless local decisions. It can also prevent necessary local decisions. The difference depends on speed, information, and the cost of delay. D-Day punished delay with exceptional severity because amphibious warfare changes by the hour. At dawn, a landing force can be vulnerable because men and equipment are separated. A few hours later, those same beaches can support organized anti-tank positions, artillery, armored vehicles, engineers, and fresh infantry. By nightfall, a foothold can become a network of routes and defended positions that no longer resembles the fragile target that existed at first light. The German command system behaved as if certainty could be purchased by waiting. But certainty was not free. The price was a stronger enemy. There is a temptation to imagine the counterfactual in simple terms. If the German armored reserves had moved immediately, could they have thrown the Allies back into the sea? No responsible answer can treat that outcome as guaranteed. The Allied invasion possessed enormous advantages. Naval gunfire could devastate exposed concentrations. Allied air power constrained movement. The landing force was massive. Allied commanders had planned for German counterattacks, and more troops and equipment were following behind the first waves. Even an earlier German armored assault might have been stopped. It might have inflicted heavier losses without changing the strategic outcome. It might have disrupted one sector while failing in another. History does not give us the result of a battle that never happened. But the importance of the command failure does not depend on proving that Germany could have won D-Day. Its significance is that the German system reduced its own options during the narrow period when those options were most valuable. A reserve exists to preserve choice, yet a reserve that cannot be released in time can become the opposite of flexibility. It becomes strength without responsiveness. That is what happened as the invasion developed. The armored formations Germany hoped to use as a decisive counterstroke entered the battle under conditions increasingly chosen by the Allies. They had to move through a battle space where Allied aircraft could interfere with roads and logistics. They approached a coast protected by naval firepower. They faced troops who had already survived the most vulnerable phase of the landing. And they did so after German headquarters had spent precious hours trying to decide whether the battlefield in front of them was really the battlefield that mattered most. The irony was severe. The strategic reserve had been preserved so it could strike at the right place. The process of preserving it helped make the right time disappear. This was not the only reason Germany failed in Normandy. It would be wrong to treat command paralysis as a single master explanation for the Allied success. The Allies had overwhelming naval power, strong air superiority, immense logistical capacity, detailed planning, deception, and a willingness to absorb terrible losses to establish the bridgehead. German coastal defenses were uneven. German formations varied in quality and mobility. Communications were vulnerable. The Luftwaffe could not challenge the invasion airspace on equal terms. The German army in France was not one perfectly mobile armored force waiting for a switch to be thrown. All of that matters. But the command structure determined how efficiently Germany could use the strength it did possess. And on June 6, efficiency of decision was a combat resource. The Allies were converting ships into soldiers on land, soldiers into defended exits, exits into roads, roads into supply routes, and supply routes into a bridgehead. Germany needed to convert warning into orders, orders into movement, movement into concentration, and concentration into a counterattack. One conversion chain worked faster than the other. That difference widened with every hour. The story of the German Panzer reserves on D-Day is therefore not really a story about tanks sitting still. It is a story about what happens when a military system cannot decide at the speed of the battlefield. The warning signs were visible before the invasion. Rommel understood the danger of daylight movement. Rundstedt understood the danger of committing reserves to the wrong coast. The High Command understood that the armored force might be the final decisive resource in France. Each concern was rational in isolation. The structure created to satisfy all of them produced a force that was divided not only by geography but by permission. Once the invasion began, that division became operational friction. The local level had urgency without enough authority. The strategic level had authority without enough certainty. The armored reserve existed between them, waiting for those two conditions to meet. They never met early enough. By the time German headquarters could be more certain about Normandy, the Allies had already used the delay to make Normandy harder to defeat. That is the trap at the center of the story. The system demanded proof before it would act, but the enemy was using the waiting period to create the proof. Every landing craft that unloaded made Normandy more obviously important. Every unit that moved inland made the bridgehead more obviously dangerous. Every hour that made the decision easier also made the counterattack harder. Near the end of June 6, the German army still had powerful armored formations in France. Those formations would fight hard in Normandy. They would inflict heavy losses. The campaign would become a grinding battle of hedgerows, villages, roads, artillery, armor, and attrition. But the unique opportunity of the first morning could not be recreated. There would be no return to the moment when Allied units were still assembling from the surf, and the German defense still had the chance to respond before the bridgehead became a system. That moment belonged to a few hours, and those hours were consumed by uncertainty, divided authority, changing local priorities, and a chain of command that made speed dependent on permission from far away. The counterfactual remains uncertain. The lost time does not. German armored formations still possessed crews, guns, fuel, and the ability to fight. But the battlefield they were meant to influence was no longer the battlefield that had existed at dawn. On D-Day, the shortest distance on the German map ran from the armored reserve to the coast. The longest ran from danger to permission.